Hello! This video is the first I'm doing which looks at some interesting legal cases. This video is going to be really useful if you're looking at applying to read law either this year or next year, and particularly useful if you don't do law at A-level like I don't. I start off by saying if you actually are looking at applying to read law, you need to be reading, you need to be going to lectures, that kind of stuff. But I think this kind of video might be helpful in sparking some interest and perhaps encouraging someone to do law. The case I'm going to look at is Lloyds Bank versus Rosset. That's how you pronounce that, Rosset. And this took place in 1990. A lot of legal cases, they're quite cool because they start off with a story, and this one is no different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by telling you the story, what can also be described as the facts of the case, and then we can talk about some of the law which was used in deciding the verdict. Notice that I have not written the verdict anywhere on here, so you're going to have to listen to what I say. Sorry about that. I suppose you could always Google it if you were so inclined. But anyway, story starts off. So you've got a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Rosset. They end up having 2 kids, and Mr. Rosset's, I should know this, it's either his aunt or his mother, or whatever, his grandmother, something like that. One of his relatives dies and leaves him some money to buy a house with. It is said in her will that Mr. Rosset, once he spends the money, the house must be in his name and his name only. So Mr. and Mrs. Rosset think, alright, cool, we'll let the house be in your name, Mr. Rosset, because otherwise we don't get any inheritance, and like money's great, so you can be the sole owner. It's alright though, because we're married, we're not going to break up anytime soon, right? Right? They decide to buy this semi-derelict house, and this is the deal. So Mr. Rosset is like a truck driver or something, I can't remember exactly what he does, but he's out of the country a lot, he's not at home much, so he's moving around a lot. He says to Mrs. Rosset, alright, you manage the renovations of the house, I'll just keep paying the mortgage while you, come there with the baby, watch the builders work, and make them tea or whatever it is you do when you supervise building work. And so Mrs. Rosset was like, okay, cool. That happened then. So Mrs. Rosset supervised the builders working. She went there every day, or near enough every day, until the project was completed. And they were both really happy. They've got a great new house that's been newly renovated. But it's still only, legally speaking, in a Mr. Rosset's name. Now Mr. Rosset, he, he's out a lot. He decides to have a mistress, which is never a good idea. He ends up taking a loan out with Lloyds Bank, and he decides to put the house up as security for the loan. So basically, if he doesn't pay the loan back, the bank can take the house. He basically kind of remortgages the house, I guess. He does that, and well, this mistress, she must have some really fine tastes, because before too long, Mr. Rosset defaults on his loan. What does this mean? Well, Lloyds Bank say he's defaulted on his loan, give us the house. Mrs. Rosset is like, no, that house is mine. I supervise the building work, I was married to the owner, my kids live here, I really want to keep this house. In fact, even if I have any ownership in this house, you can't take it off me, because you can't take something from someone if that wasn't the deal. And this is what started this whole legal case. It was Mrs. Rosset saying, I have some sort of ownership of this property because I supervise the building work, I live there with my kids, I was married to the owner, and therefore I should be able to keep the house, basically. This leads us to the question of legal ownership versus equitable ownership. The explanation I heard of this, which was really, really good, was a comparison to a banana. you've got the skin of the banana on the outside, and that's what everyone sees, right? But most of the banana is inside the banana. So legal ownership is like the yellow skin, and equitable ownership is like the actual fruit. Legal ownership is a very easy thing to solve. It's whoever legally owns the house, which quite obviously was always going to be Mr. Rosset. In terms of legal ownership, Mr. Rosset owns the entirety of the house, and the reason for that is if he didn't own the entirety of the house, he wouldn't have been able to buy it, because that was the condition of the inheritance. But equitable ownership is far less straightforward. And when courts have a question of, well, when they did have a question of equitable ownership, they could look at constructive trusts. And this is where the court looks for things which constitute trusts and therefore give some degree of equitable ownership. Now, there are two types of constructive trusts that we can look at. The first of which being an implied bargain. But actually no, let's start off with express bargain. An express bargain is very simple. Let's say, I don't know, two people are married. They buy a house in 1990, and then in 1992, for example, they wake up one morning, they're having breakfast at the breakfast table, and one of them is like, hey, who actually owns this house that we bought together? And, well, the second goes, I don't know, I mean, you work, so let's just say you own 90% and I own 10%. They both agree on it. That is an express bargain. Notice how it doesn't need to be in writing, and therefore it adds this other dimension which I'll talk about in a second. There was no such express bargain with Mr. and Mrs. Rosset, and what's very important is they would have had to actually said it or actually written something. They didn't. I'll go on to speak about that in a second. Then there's implied bargains, which are far, they're not far more, I guess, easy to prove. In fact, no, I'll say yeah, they are easier to prove than express bargains, especially when the express bargains are conducted through speech. But the implied bargains are basically mortgages. So if I pay part of a mortgage for a house, I am therefore claiming some degree of equitable ownership. It's quite simple, really. One thing I failed to mention with express bargain, which I should have mentioned, is that not only does there need to be an agreement in place between the two parties, but either of the party needs to have acted to their own detriment in the belief that there was this agreement in place. What that means is acting to your own detriment means, like, I don't know, paying money or giving up time, mostly paying money. An example I can think of is, let's say you and I buy a house together and we agree it's 50-50 split, and then I act to my detriment by paying a painter to come and paint the front of the property. I wouldn't have paid a painter to paint the front of our property if I didn't think we were 50-50, right? So therefore I've acted to my own detriment in the belief that you and I had a deal. And by the way, that's really bad of you to break that deal that we had. What we have here then is Mr. and Mrs. Rosset. Neither of them have agreed an express bargain. Has Mrs. Rosset paid anything to the mortgage? Well, of course not. She doesn't work. She's at home looking after the kids. And really, why would you bother paying for the mortgage if you've already got, if it's already been fully bought by Mr. Rosset's inheritance? Plus, it's something really awkward, right? So let's say the man of the house, for example, is paying the mortgage in full. Isn't it easier to just say, all right, Mr. Whatever, you pay the mortgage, I buy the food, I buy food shopping, whatever. So it puts one party at a disadvantage. The House of Lords ruled then that Mrs. Rosset had no equitable ownership of the property because she did not have an express bargain and there was no implied bargain. Therefore, Lloyds were really quite happy because they could take the house. I don't know how Mr. Rosset felt about it. I don't think he cared much at that point. His life was a bit of a wreck. But regardless, this is a huge case and it has a lot of impact. So these are some of the things we can consider, right? The first being, who actually talks about how much of a property they own? It's a really awkward thing to talk about. So let's say two people get married. It's really awkward to just say, alright, well, if we divorce, or if I die, or if, I don't know, I get a mistress and default on our mortgage, how much of the house do we actually own? It's just, no one likes to talk about it. And that's for two things, right? One, obviously it's quite awkward, but secondly, a lot of people don't know. It's not a given that you decide and create an express bargain on home ownership. People probably think that it's all down to the legal ownership, but in reality that's not the case. The second thing is this ruling, well, it fails to recognise observing work or taking part in work as a detriment. So when Mrs. Rosset was going and observing the workers, that could be seen as her detriment. What was missing now, however, was of course the express bargain, which I suppose goes back to the idea of how awkward it is to talk about who owns what. Another issue with this ruling is it's very, well, it's not sexist, like, it's not inherently sexist, but it's quite gendered in the sense that, like, men tend to be the breadwinners, therefore men tend to pay the mortgage. So if the man suddenly does what Mr. Rosset did and kind of screws the woman over, she's not going to have an implied bargain because she wouldn't have paid the mortgage. It's a shame that things are like that, but quite frankly that's the way they are. Also, women tend to earn less, not because of any lack of skill, but just because of the society we live in, and therefore they're going to have less of a chance of paying the mortgage. This decision was eventually challenged. Well, not challenged, I mean it was contradicted by the case of Stack versus Dowden in 2007. 2007, yeah. I'm not going to go into that too much in this video. If this video does well, I might go and give Stack versus Dowden a look. But this is a basis of equity and trusts. It's all about looking at who owns what, and kind of peeling the banana, I suppose, and seeing what the reality of like legal ownership is. Please like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more of my content, and I hope to see you again next time.